Hi, it's Tim Grant.
And Nikki McLeod from the Righting Wrongs podcast.
This episode contains descriptions of a murder.
We'll explore themes related to a confession to murder that appears to be created by police interrogation questions.
Our discussion will, as always, include an in-depth analysis of how forensic linguistic techniques played a role in unravelling what occurred in this case.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Righting Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics, Series 1, Episode 6, The Disputed Confessions of Darnell Rusan.
Hello and welcome to Righting Wrongs, the podcast from AIFL, the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We're all about improving the delivery of justice through the analysis of language. I'm Professor Tim Grant.
And I'm Dr Nikki McLeod, Deputy Director of AIFL. So, Tim, what sort of case are we looking at today?
This is a murder case from St. Louis in the United States. In terms of the forensic linguistics, it involves an analysis of a confession to that murder. In fact, the suspect confessed no fewer than 11 times, and this was recorded on tape. The language analysis, though, was able to show why these confessions should not have been relied on by the courts. And today's guest is Dr Marlon Hurt, a forensic linguist and an analyst from the New York-based Robert Leonard Associates.
Marlon is a forensic linguist who did his PhD here at Aston with you, Tim, as I'm sure you know. His PhD was on threat analysis, in those cases where the threat is made against a third party, so not against the recipient of the threat. These are what we call pledges to harm. He's taught on the Hofstra University MA in Forensic Linguistics, which is one of very few such programmes internationally, of course, another one being ours here at Aston. Spun out of Hofstra is the Forensic Linguistic Consultancy, Rob Leonard Associates, which is where Marlon now works. I feel like I should say here, because we might not get round to this point, that Rob Leonard played at Woodstock. Let's get that in.
Whenever his name's mentioned, that has to be there in brackets, doesn't it? Yeah. But anyway, let's go on.
Name of the band?
Shauna.
Yeah.
And he wore a gold lame suit, and it's on YouTube.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Okay, so...
Yeah. He still wears it.
Oh, he still wears it. Great. Well, yeah, so the other voice you can hear there is Marlon Hurt himself. So welcome, Marlon. It's good to have you here.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Yes, welcome. It's good to see you again, Marlon.
Good to see you too. But for the record, I don't know if Rob still has the lame suit. I don't want to get...
Before we get into the specifics of this case, can you tell us a little bit about where it fits into your career? Tell us a little bit about your work as a forensic linguist more generally.
This actually, funnily enough, fits right in with a lot of threads of the consultancy work that I've done with Robert Leonard Associates, or RLA. The way that RLA is kind of structured, well, it didn't used to be structured. It used to be Rob, and he by himself was the consultant, the analyst, the expert witness, and then over the years, he's gathered around him various different experts, which includes Dr. Julianne Ford, who was also one of Tim's PhD students, and the soon-to-be Dr. Dakota Wing, along with quite a few other excellent, not quite PhD students who do all kinds of very helpful work. And so over the years, RLA has actually become a lot more structured. And what this has meant is, even though we all comment on essentially every case that comes through the consultancy, which is the real strength of the model, is you're getting all of these expertises looking for any holes or any alternate hypotheses in whatever kind of data is coming through for the case. But we also end up kind of with our own niches. And so mine have come to be not just threat analysis, which is, as you mentioned, what I worked on with Tim, but also confessions. And so when a confession case comes through RLA, I'm usually the first person to take a crack at it.
So would you say that the majority of the cases you work on are in the sort of criminal sphere then, or have you worked on civil cases as well?
I've worked on both. I would say that predominantly it's been criminal. Mostly what comes through RLA are criminal. We've had, our fair share of trademark cases and copyright and all kinds of other civil disputes come through, which I have also helped with.
Okay, so we may come back to trademark disputes in a later episode, mightn't we?
Yes. I don't think we have any in plan for this series, but who knows? We hope for a series 2. Let's move on to the specific case we're talking about today, that of Darnell Rusan, and let's open up the case file.
Dante Parker was shot dead on the streets of a St. Louis neighborhood during the Christmas period of 2019. Along with the bullets, police retrieved a couple of seconds of footage captured by a Ring door camera, which showed a man walking towards the scene of a crime and then quickly walking away. No arrests were made at the time. However, a year later, Darnell Rusan was picked up during a traffic stop. Because he resembled the figure in the 2 seconds of Ring footage, he became the prime suspect in Dante Parker's murder. This led to a 3.5-hour video-recorded interrogation of Rusan performed by Detective Beery Bowles, during which Rusan appeared to try to confess to the murder on 11 separate occasions. Rusan's lawyer approached Robert Leonard Associates, a forensic linguistics company associated with Hofstra University in New York State, and Dr Marlon Hurt took up the case. Knowing how damning a single confession can be to a suspect, Dr. Hurt had a tricky task. The question he had to address was whether any of the 11 confessions were linguistically sound, or alternatively, whether he could show through his language analysis that there were any grounds for ignoring this apparently damning evidence. Dr. Hurt's analysis focused on the provenance of the information that Rusan was apparently providing within the confession. He was able to determine that across all 11 confession attempts, which superficially resembled specific event knowledge of Dante Parker's death, Rusan introduced just one piece of information that was not previously provided by the interviewing detective. This was the unverifiable claim that the gun used was a revolver. Dr. Hurt was able to show that all other items of information that had apparently been provided by Rusan had in fact originated within the questions of Detective Beery Bowles. This included the nature of the murder weapon, characteristics of the victim, and other circumstances of the crime. Dr. Hurt was deposed in the case, but ultimately the judge decided to disallow his testimony on the grounds that expert evidence was not required to raise the points made. The linguistic analysis was, however, used to assist Rusan's lawyer in planning his questions, and ultimately, Darnell Rusan was acquitted.
Intriguing case, and we're going to start off by listening to a decent chunk of this police interview where these confessions took place. We're going to listen to a couple of minutes just to kind of get a flavour of that interview. The section we're about to hear is taken from right at the end of this interview. So as you heard there, it was 3.5 hours long, and this is towards the end. It includes what's essentially a full confession to committing the murder. Quite a bit of detail here as well. Yeah, I should just sort of warn listeners that this is from the original police video. The quality isn't good, so you will have to listen carefully to sort of make out what's being said.
Talking about hurting you, it's 2-on-1, you know. So what happened after that? You're right there in front of him.
I get the gun from the homeboy.
Okay.
I tell him about the situation. He had me the thumper or whatever. And I'm like, shit.
You gotta do that.
Yeah, like,
how many times did you shoot?
I just held the trigger, like, you know what I'm saying?
Like 1 time, 2 times, like boom, pause?
Like, pow. Like, when I hold the trigger, I pulled it. Like,
Okay.
it's enough, man.
It
was a him or me situation. That's how I felt.
I feel you. What kind of gun did you have?
It was a revolver. I don't know. It was a 38 or what it was.
A revolver? Okay. And you don't know if you shot
It wasn't my gun. Like I say, I don't have no gun, sir.
And so, was you able to shoot old boy? Was he trying to get up on you too, like his friend?
No, he took off running.
He ran first after the shot, or you didn't get a chance to shoot him because he ran? Like, what was the?
He ran.
He ran first?
Yeah.
Okay. What happened to old boy? Did he still try to attack you after you shot him, or what?
No, I mean, I turned around and went through and ran myself.
Okay. So So where did the dude who got shot, where did he go? I mean, did he run across the street, or where exactly?
Like he was headed towards the street.
There's loads of detail here. We've got a transcript here in front of us, and we've got bits of detail such as that he got a gun from the homeboy. He pulled the trigger. We've got the information that the gun is a revolver. We've got this information at the end. There are people running, where they ran to, and so on. So loads of detail. Does this feel typical of the interview more generally?
Well, now that you've gotten a flavor of it, I want to give a shout out to Peter Amati, who was a student who actually helped me with the transcript. Very invaluable. As you can imagine, from the quality of the audio and how the two were speaking to each other, it was a little difficult to put together. So Peter was a great help. In terms of how this compares to the rest of the interrogation, this is far more coherent on both people's parts, on the detective's parts and Rusan's part. And what we call cohesive, meaning actually answering the question, than the other 3 hours of what went on here.
We picked that clip because it's, you might be surprised to understand, it's one of the easier bits to listen to. There's a lot of long pauses and, like you say, answers to questions which don't answer the question, and so on and so forth. So that is certainly a more cohesive section, I think.
So this extract, obviously that's taken from a tape, and here in the UK, certainly in England and Wales, it's required to tape record all suspect interviews, or to audio record them, and most of them are actually video recorded. You've got one here, obviously, from the States that's been recorded. Is that common? Is it sort of widespread to record suspect interviews in the US?
Unfortunately, no. You all are far beyond us in that respect. It is getting better here. It is far more common here now to require the recording of interviews and interrogations when, say, a capital crime has been committed. But if you're, say, being brought in for assault or something like that, the chances that your time in the station is going to be recorded are low here in the United States.
Yeah, and I've noticed another sort of difference, that Nikki and I are used to the label or the language of investigative interview, and you're using interrogation. We almost never use in the UK these days.
Absolutely. And I'm using interrogation quite consciously, because this was not an information gathering interview. From the outset, the detective had in mind that he had the perpetrator of this murder, and by Jove, he was going to get a confession. And that fits the textbook definition of an interrogation.
Yeah, so it's reflective of the aim of the interaction, isn't it? So interrogation is focused on gaining a confession, whereas the model that we're used to in England and Wales is the investigative interview, which is about gathering as much high quality information as is possible without necessarily seeking the confession.
So just for our listeners, interviewing techniques in the UK are under what's known as the PEACE model, which is an acronym. I'm not going to run through the acronym, but it starts prepare and engage and so on. Whereas the model that is of interrogation that's often used, not exclusively used, but often used in American suspect interactions of this type, is sometimes called the Reed method. And this is named after a particular sort of researcher who devised the method for getting a confession out of someone who was known to be guilty. But the assumption of known to be guilty is made before the interview or before the interrogation rather than afterwards. So there's this contrast of methods that is still largely true across the United States, although I understand that NYPD, for example, are moving towards the PEACE method, and there are other police forces and jurisdictions where it may be coming in. But there is still this contrast.
Yeah. It is getting adopted in sort of little enclaves here and there, but yeah. Okay, so we've got a flavour of this interview. We're going to get back now to your work on the case.
So you were kind enough to provide your expert report for us to review in preparation for this episode. And I'd like to go sort of back to the beginning of the interview, because you start in that report sort of critiquing how Mr. Rusan was read his rights, whether he was in a position to understand his rights and so on. So what were your concerns here?
Here, the problem was Rusan didn't know why he was there. He had been picked up in a traffic stop. The woman that he was with ran a stop sign, I think it was, and they got pulled over. He ended up in jail. I don't actually know the timeline for this, but at some point detectives decided that he was connected to the Dante Parker shooting. And so he had just been being held. And then he was pulled into this interview room. And what he wanted from the detective was just to know why he was there. I mean, think about it. If one of us, almost Kafka-esque, was pulled off the street into an interview room, you don't know why you're there, and the detective tells you that you have to agree that you understand your Miranda rights before he will tell you why you're there. There's this immense emotional pressure just to say yes. So, Miranda, this is a warning that police across the United States are required to give when they place somebody in custody. So, when they arrest you, they are required to tell you what your rights are under the American Constitution. And so we've all heard the right to remain silent, the right to a lawyer, these kinds of things. And in fact, just a little plug, but the other expert I work with, Dakota Wing, has some great work on where this goes wrong in American media, for instance. So in theory, the way this works is the detective tells you what your rights are. If you understand them, you agree that you understand them, and you have a choice then whether to immediately ask for a lawyer or to wait and answer questions. As I said, though, Rusan didn't know why he was there, and the detective capitalized on this. The detective, in his interaction with Rusan, he would say, for instance, that Miranda's an obstacle. I can't tell you until you agree that you understand your Miranda rights. But then he would also say, but Miranda's a small thing, right? So it's an obstacle that is very easy to overcome. In fact, the detective frames it as merely a formality, right? We just have to get this out of the way so that I can give you what you want. And the way that we kind of talk about it in pragmatics is a conversational agenda. What are we trying to achieve? And Rusan is trying to achieve an answer to the question of why am I here? And so the detective is saying, I can't fulfill your agenda until you agree that you understand your Miranda rights. And even with all this, Rusan, at the end of all of this, says, no. What does that mean? But then instead of paraphrasing, for instance, right, which every teacher knows, you get a question from a student, and rather than literally parroting back the language that caused a lack of understanding, you try to paraphrase. But instead, the detective here just reads the same thing verbatim, after which Rusan agrees that he now understands miraculously the thing that he did not understand before.
So because Rusan doesn't know why he's there, he doesn't understand why he's been read his rights, he doesn't understand his rights, but he sort of ends up agreeing that he understands them. That's the view that comes over in the report, I think, that he just wants it to move on or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I guess I won't generalize, but one of my cardinal rules that I talk about with the master's students at Hofstra, for instance, in the FL program, is you don't have to take people at their word. In fact, it's often better to look to the context and make sure that it comports with what's going on. And so in this instance, I would say, yes, everything in the broader discourse argues that Rusan is saying this just to find out why he's there. That if anything, his denial, no, I don't understand the rights, is probably the truer of the responses.
So there's this issue about his rights, whether he understood them and understands why he's there. And there's, in this early part of the report, there's also potential mental health issues that are raised. So how are these raised? And what do you think the implications of that are?
Very early on, Detective Bowles asks, are you diagnosed? And Rusan rightly says, well, what do you mean? The detective says, well, are you certified? Which is, in this day and age, a little derogatory.
Certified in the United States context means in a mental health institutionalized sense?
Yeah, it's often used in a not kind way, as in, she's certifiable is a not nice way of saying that she's crazy, for instance.
But in its formal use, the doctor or a psychiatrist would certify that someone was, well, in old-fashioned language, certify that they were insane. In other words, give a formal diagnosis that they had a mental health issue.
That's right. Which isn't to say, that you can't use the language, but it definitely has connotations. So Rusan says, yes, bipolar or, what is it called? This is a theme that I know we're going to come back to, but Rusan is now asking the detective what the name of his potential mental disorder is. So rather than providing his own diagnosis, he's now asking the detective for the name of his own diagnosis. And Detective Bowles here discursively takes the bait and says, schizophrenia. Like, that's one I know of. Bipolar, schizophrenia, and finally settles simply on mental disorders. To which Rusan says, yeah. In terms of like the scope of things, when we talk about, for instance, semantics, right? The study of meaning, we can talk about the word cat has a broad scope. We can be talking about house cats and lions and tigers and, right, all this stuff. Where if I say, for instance, an American Shorthair, I'm talking about a very particular kind of cat, right? So mental disorders is this very broad scope. And at this point, Rusan having agreed, the detective just kind of says, oh, okay, mental disorders, right? And sort of checks the box.
In terms of the context of a police interview, this should highlight to the officer that, there may be issues, I guess, of suggestibility or maybe issues of vulnerability at the very least for this interviewee. And there may be protocols involving, getting someone checked out or something before you proceed with the interview. I'm talking from my UK experience, but presumably this should have been a bit of a flag to the interviewing officer to take some course of action.
It should have raised the alarm.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge red flag, and it's amazing that it just gets skipped over. Because it's not just suggestibility, it's also comprehension.
Yeah. That sort of a large part of your report concerns it's a discussion really of where the information came from, all those bits of detail that we saw there in that interview. And for that, you draw on the work of Roger Shy. So this is a very famous American applied linguist who shies away from the label forensic linguist. That is an applied linguist whose work happens to be applied largely in the forensic and legal context. So can you tell us a little bit about Roger's work?
Yeah, so you are right that he does shy away from forensic linguist. He opts for linguist. I had the pleasure of taking an intensive course with him where he made the rather convincing argument that actually we're all just sociolinguists of various stripes. And he is often called the godfather of forensic linguistics here in the United States. The real benefit of his work was in taking the sociolinguistic principles that he was very familiar with as a professor at Georgetown University and applying them to issues of the law. Before him here in the United States, this really hadn't been done in the way that he was doing it. You had had forensic linguistics of a kind of proto variety, for instance, in the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, where everybody was doing their own home analysis of the ransom note and this kind of stuff. But Roger, he would, as you said, shy away from the comparison, but here in the US is almost kind of a Saussureish sort of figure where he systematized the thing. He also is prolific. So we know a lot about these experiences and techniques. He has written dozens and dozens of books and still actually consults with Rob on select cases. And so what this has meant is that when we get cases like this that are, say, not about necessarily the technical aspects of syntax or semantics or something like this, when they're about discourse and conversation like this, Roger is often a kind of first stop in terms of what does the literature say. And so in this particular case, it was almost like it was custom built for a Roger Shy analysis. When I started digging into what was going on here, I found so many things that Roger had already encountered in his own casework. The use of presupposition.
Marlon, can you just explain what you mean by presupposition?
Sure. It's generally treated in pragmatics, which is the study of meaning and context. It sort of straddles semantics, though, too, which is just the study of meaning, kind of blind to context. And what it is information taken for granted in a discourse. So the kind of classic example, right, is when did you stop beating your wife? And the presupposition there, of course, because there's no right answer. You can say, well, yesterday, or I haven't, right? Because that's the question is asking for when, and the presupposition is that you've been beating your wife.
So the question itself contains information which becomes undeniable.
That's right. And the presupposition there is that it's taken for granted. I don't know if that's actually a classic joke over in the UK, but over here in the US, another would be, when did you stop smoking? And the presupposition is that you were or are still a smoker, right? It becomes part of what's taken for granted in the interaction. And they're very pernicious that way, because you then have to go out of your way to deny it, which is not always a preferred way of having a conversation, right? Well, I've never been a smoker, right? Well, now you're in an argument, right? And people don't generally like that kind of conflict. They can be subtle, and if you don't catch them, they can be problematic.
In the report itself, you refer to these sort of three sources of information that can be found in suspect statements more generally, and that you look for it in these statements. So you have this sort of specific event knowledge that only the suspect or the killer would know. You have sort of more general world knowledge that anyone might know about a case. So if I'm asked a question and I answer just because anyone would know that doesn't implicate me as being a suspect in the case. And then you have this idea of sort of more second-hand knowledge. You use that framework of these three sources of knowledge in the case. So in summary, where was most of the information that Rusan was able to provide? Was it general world knowledge? Was it knowledge that only the killer would know? Or what was it in this third category of second-hand knowledge?
99% of it was second-hand knowledge derived from the detective himself.
So the main body of your report is suggesting that this knowledge actually came from Detective Bowles, and that Rusan may have known them only because he'd been told them first. That's the thrust of the main part of the report.
Yes, that's right. And I'll say that if there had been a single piece of verifiable information that was specific event knowledge, that would have argued for Rusan's guilt. All I was looking for to kind of disprove or prove either hypothesis, and in this case, the hypotheses were he did it or he didn't. All I would have needed was a piece of specific event knowledge to have to go back to the lawyer and say, I'm very sorry, but either we can't help you or your client is in trouble.
Yeah, so it would have taken only one item of knowledge that only the killer could have known, and that would have indicated guilt. And that's sort of what you failed to find. So we're going to get into a couple of examples of this. So first, there's some detail about hearing some gunshots. And at this point in the conversation, as you've said, Rusan starts not knowing why he's there at all, is about a traffic stop. And what you get is the detective introducing this topic of gunshots, which contains information about the murder weapon, that it might be a violent crime and all these things. It wasn't a knife. Yeah. So all that information is introduced by the detective. Let's hear that part of the interview.
Well, tell me what happened. Tell me what happened. You was there. You heard the shots. Or the shots happened. What happened? You was there.
So what happens next? And it's important to say that in this sort of disconnected part of the interview, this comes along about 10 minutes later. You don't get a direct answer to that question by Rusan. So the detective is asking, tell me what happened, and mentions shots. And about 10 minutes further on, we hear Rusan saying that he heard shots. So we'll listen to that bit.
And like I say, I go in Unc house, I heard, I look, they open the door.
We've got Rusan there making the sounds of the gunshots that he's supposed to have heard. And up until that point, there's been no mention of him of guns or shooting sounds. But this was introduced by the detective.
He sounds incredibly distressed, though, as well. In both those clips, actually, he seems to almost be wailing in the.
I've in preparation for this episode, I did listen through the whole interview, and that comes across in various sections. He's just bewildered and doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah. Okay, so next up, we've got some clips where we can hear information about the victim and his height. So it's a similar sort of pattern as we heard with the last two. The first clip we can hear Detective Bowles talking about the victim's height, saying that the victim is taller than Rusan. And then we will hear from Rusan about this same topic.
What was he doing to you? And you a small dude. I come from you a small dude. The dude's a tall dude. So, I mean, did he get the best of you?
And then here's the clip from 10 minutes later, where Rusan introduces this topic.
No, he pushed me, like, get off my friend. I tried to grab him with my reflex. Okay. But he was bigger than me, and he pushed off.
For both these areas of information, that there was a gun involved, there were gunshots, that it was a murder using a gun, and these characteristics of the victim, that he was tall, in both these cases, and your report details many, many others, details in the confession, what's occurring is the detective introduces a topic, and then sometime later that's picked up and reflected back by Rusan. The Rusan's not providing any new information that he's not already heard. And you call this provision sort of information, or one form of it is scripting, literally telling Rusan what to say. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is something that Roger Shai talks about quite a bit in his work. And what it is essentially is exactly what you said, but it goes two ways. So it's not just that I can tell you to say something. So in undercover cases, sometimes you'll have the cooperating witness or the undercover officer kind of saying, well, just tell him that you'll do it for $100 or whatever it may be, right? It can be kind of formulated in the negative, which we also see here in the interview of, I don't want to hear this. I don't want to hear that you weren't there. I don't want to hear that you don't know what happened. And so we actually find this going both ways here. But one of the interesting things in this case was it was a slippery slope in that during the Miranda event, trying to be helpful, I assume, Detective Bowles actually scripts Rusan about how to ask for a lawyer. He says, now, if you decide that you don't want to talk to me anymore, you just say, Detective Bowles, I want a lawyer. And this looks very innocent on its face. And in fact, in some situations, depending on, the interviewee, maybe a minor, a teenager, these kinds of scripts can perhaps be helpful. But in this case, it just ballooned. The detective then started scripting him about all kinds of other things related to the crime itself, to the point where you couldn't be sure what was actually coming from Rusan or the detective. And in fact, one of the very interesting things here, and perhaps speaks to the unexplored mental disorders, is, as I've already mentioned, Rusan actually solicits scripts from the detective. For instance, about the mental disorders, when he says, well, what is it called? What is it called? Bipolar? What is it called? Sure. And that kind of dynamic between the two men actually happens throughout, where Rusan will look to him for, well, what do you want me to say next?
I think it's worth remembering as well that even for sort of non-vulnerable interviewees, the distribution of power, the asymmetry or the lack of symmetry, inequality of power in that particular context can lead to this. You'll look at, people who go and encounter the police will be looking to the person in control, the interviewer, for guidance on how to provide a description or describe any kind of mental illnesses or whatever it might be. That's where they're going to be looking for their help to do that. So.
Earlier you mentioned that all you were looking for was a sort of single item of information or verifiable information in the transcript that would indicate that Rusan was indeed the killer, was there at the event. So was there anything in the transcript, in the detail of the confession, that Rusan provided for himself that hadn't previously been provided or scripted by the detective?
There was a single piece of information, which is that the weapon was a revolver. So first off, that's not verifiable because the police did not recover a weapon. All the police know is what they learned from the bullets. So things like caliber, right? Which Rusan also hedges on. He doesn't commit to what caliber the weapon was, but he does say it's a revolver. And what I actually didn't have a chance to get into in the report is even there's a question. because at various points he says he just squeezes the trigger. One pull, multiple shots, that's not how revolvers work. They are not semi-automatic. There's no semi-automatic revolver. So even there, the kind of one piece of information that unequivocally comes from Rusan himself is unverifiable and potentially contradictory to other things that he has said elsewhere in the interrogation.
So although there was this item of information, it doesn't provide that detail which shows that he was indeed at the scene. It's not enough. It's not that final piece of evidence.
That's right. And in fact, it could have been. It very much could have been. So if the detective had withheld the information that they recovered a revolver, and then Rusan had been the source of the information about it being a revolver, that would have been pretty damning. But that's not what happens here.
What happened? Were there any examples of Rusan introducing information that wasn't helpful to the officers? Did that happen at all? And if so, what happened?
I don't think that he actually introduced any information. As you were asking the question, this put me in mind of another of Tim's PhD students, Isabella Pickernell. In her work on deception, she talks about cooperatively vague. And what she meant by that is a lot of verbiage that isn't really verifiable, but seems to be cooperating. Yeah, I'm being helpful. I'm giving you all this language, but there's nothing in it that you can actually pin down. And in fact, I was put in mind of Isabella's work quite a lot during this because of that, because Rusan would have this spew of language, and if you kind of pulled it apart, there was nothing there that hadn't already been provided by the detective or was simply unverifiable. So there's the whole story, for instance, of him trying to go through a gangway, a passage between two houses. And in some of the stories, there's an obstruction. In some of them, there's not. And the detective can't make sense on a map of where Rusan is supposed to be at any given point. And part of the reason for that is it's just part of this kind of spew of information that doesn't actually inform.
Okay, so what do you mean by blocking?
Yeah, so this is, again, something else that came from Roger Schei's work. It is when a cooperating witness or an undercover officer, usually is what Roger is talking about, just will not let the person speak or overlaps them at moments that could be exculpatory for the target. And so looking at Detective Bowles's kind of language behavior here, there were many, many instances when it was clear that Rusan was about to disagree or contradict what the detective had said. And there are verbal cues we use for that, right? Where I would say, somebody starts to say, but, or they start to say, well, look. We have these conversational cues to kind of indicate that we're about to disagree or contradict. The detective would just cut him off, would interrupt him, would talk over him, and wouldn't let him put in whatever it was that he was trying to say. He blocked him.
In summary, the question of these details, the only verifiable details came from the detective rather than from Rusan themselves. And in that sense, it was a badly conducted interview or interrogation if it was meant to seek information. It feels like that perhaps because of his vulnerabilities, or perhaps anyway, the only information came from the detective, not the interviewee. So your overall conclusion is this is a bad confession or set of confessions. So let's hear the actual formal conclusions of your report. We've got Sam, our producer, voicing them up.
In Detective Bowles's language behaviour, analysis reveals that the detective routinely provides scripts of the kind of language he expects Mr. Rusan either to reproduce or to avoid. The detective seeds factual information about the shooting to Mr. Rusan via presuppositions. The detective regularly blocks Mr. Rusan's attempts to deny or disagree, and the detective repeatedly insists that Mr. Rusan choose from a closed list of options that include only his culpability. In Mr. Rusan's language behaviour, analysis reveals that he reproduces the factual information provided to him through the detective's scripting and presuppositions. He introduces little to no factual information of his own, and he self-generates almost no information about the shooting itself.
What happened next? I understand you were deposed. Now, this is a process we don't have in our system. It's something I heard Tammy Gales talking about at the IAFL conference just last year here at Aston. She was talking about it during one of her papers. Sounds absolutely terrifying. Can you explain the process of deposition? What does that mean?
It is absolutely terrifying. To kind of give a sense of it, I'm going to contrast it. I actually have had the privilege of testifying as an expert witness in a different murder confession case in the state of California. So they flew me out. I took the stand. I got to hear the judge snap the gavel and, declare me an expert witness, which was kind of cool. It was a jury case, and that was a delight. The whole thing was just a pleasure because it operated much like a classroom. There was the jury. It started with the attorney who had hired RLA. I was testifying on behalf of our analysis for RLA. It started with the attorney who had hired us. This allowed me to kind of lay out my reasons, my thinking to the jury in a way that was very similar to like an undergrad class. And it was great. And then the opposing attorney got up and she asked some hard questions, but I had had a chance to kind of lay the foundation of my thinking, my analysis, right? And so it was much easier to field those questions because that work had already been done. In a deposition, there's none of that. So I took the oath and the opposing attorney just went right after me. There's no jury, there's no judge, there was no preamble, there was no chance for me to kind of lay out my thinking, my analysis, why I came to my conclusions. It was just an hour and a half of attack dog.
What's the purpose of this process? What's it aiming to achieve?
I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that the goal of this is to give the opposing attorney a chance to grill the expert witness to determine whether or not the expert testimony should be allowed in. So we have over here a couple laws, Daubert and Frye, that govern. You all do it so much better, but we have Daubert and Frye where the expert has to qualify as essentially an expert every single case. And so the opposing attorney can then decide whether they want to mount a Daubert or a Frye challenge to the expert. Sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not, but that's kind of what the deposition is in service of. I will say without any dent in my pride that after the hour and a half of that experience, I shed tears.
Oh dear. Yeah, I have experienced cross-examinations where I felt similar, I think. So take us through to the end of the case after the deposition. What happens next, Marlon?
So this is just a literary twist for me because after, and now you, Tim, have heard all 3.5 hours of this monstrosity, right? All of the false starts, all of the non-answers, all of the verbiage, right? The blizzard of language being produced by both men, the lack of coherence, the lack of cohesion. After all of this, the judge sided with the opposing attorney in disallowing my testimony because it was so clear.
So what do you mean by blizzard of language?
I mean, it's a handy metaphor for just a lot of talking that doesn't really amount to much. And what I mean by that is Rusan, for instance, will not complete his thoughts, which is kind of its own kind of false start. He'll get some way into a sentence and then he'll stop and he'll start in on something different. And so you don't know what the rest of the first sentence was. And if you kind of think that all of us have a limited working memory for language in conversation, if you have somebody who is constantly stopping themselves and restarting, you're eventually going to get lost because you can't ever close that open tab. There's an incomplete thought that you're trying to make sense of, and it's an open tab. To use mix the metaphor, if you've got a blizzard of language, you essentially are you're opening tabs over and over again until the processing fails. And then you're sort of saying, well, I don't know what's happening anymore. That was absolutely something that Rusan did regularly, which makes it difficult to kind of wade through and see what he's actually saying, if he's actually saying anything of substance.
I got the bit that your testimony as an expert witness was not allowed because it was so clear. Can you unpack that a bit?
The judge, of course, has access to these reports. So after my deposition testimony, it's no better word for it because I was under oath, and reviewing the report, the judge decided that it was all very clear. It's so apparent that this is what's happening, that there's nothing that I could do to help the jury understand the issue better. I've kind of characterized this as a backhanded compliment because it was kind of saying that after wading through 3.5 hours of this blizzard, as I described it, of language, that I managed to find the threads in such a way that it just seemed natural to the judge.
So one of the common grounds for admissibility across the UK and the American system is this idea that you can only admit expert testimony if that's over and above what the jury can expect to understand or work out from themselves. And so the judge, I think it was saying that it was obvious that the police officer introduced all these details, and it was obvious that Rusan were just picking up on things that had been told to them through the interrogation process. The linguistic expertise wasn't required at all. Is that the long and the short of it?
That very much is. And even just your summary makes me chuckle because of how far-fetched it is given the data in this case.
Let me press you a bit on that because it required an analysis. It required a close listening, and it required a transcription to be made. I don't think you could have come to your conclusions without having the transcript in front of you. But did it really require linguistics? Did it just require someone to pay close attention? Where's the linguistics in this?
Well, the linguistics, I think, are, in this particular case, at the level of the pragmatics. So pragmatics, in our line of work, being the study of meaning in context. This also gets at how conversation is conducted. Pragmatics would look at things like who raises a topic. And so in this particular case, what I was doing in part was looking at, for instance, who raises the topic of the murder weapon and in what way? Who raises the topic of the scene of the crime? Who raises the topic of qualities of the victim? The linguistics really was, in this case, as Roger has talked about, Roger Shy, in being able to kind of see through a lot of the verbiage to find what was actually happening in the conversation between the two men. And I'll say, for instance, that one of the things that Roger talks about, which I didn't have need of in this analysis, is contamination. And Roger's idea of contamination is that if you hear two people talking, say, you ascribe the content of that conversation to both people. So if one person tells an off-color joke to a layperson, you will often walk away thinking that both people are off-color, rather than recognizing that the joke came from a particular source in the conversation. And that is, in reality, what I was doing here. The danger was that a jury would look at this information, and if contamination was at work, they wouldn't be able to see the provenance of the information because it was being repeated back. It was being repeated by both men. And so trying to pinpoint where it came from, as you said, without a transcript, without the video, without multiple close listens, I think is frankly humanly impossible. And that's where the linguist was necessary.
Okay, that's really interesting because another famous and now sadly departed New York forensic linguist, Larry Solon, in a slightly different context, but he described the role of the linguist as being a tour guide. So helping the jury to come to their conclusion through the sort of the setting out clearly of how language works. And it is a version of that maybe that you've achieved in this case, I think.
Rest in peace, Larry. But yes, that's an excellent metaphor for it. It's just trying to kind of clear away the weeds and show the jury what actually is in the conversation.
Now, obviously, you wouldn't have stood a chance of doing this if it hadn't have been recorded. You had a recording to work with. You're able to transcribe. We've talked in our first episode, actually, we were talking about the Timothy Evans case, which was a famous case from the 1950s. And we talked there about how the bringing in of mandatory audio recording of suspect interviews brought in a lot of protections. That happened in 1984. Well, came in with the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984 in England and Wales. And we've talked about how that kind of, to a certain extent, protects vulnerable suspects. But in this case, we've got a recording. It was recorded. And there are many other cases that listeners may have heard of. The Brendan Dassey case is a big famous one, for example, where the 15-year-old nephew of Stephen Avery, so this was on the Making a Murderer documentary, he was video recorded and was clearly a vulnerable young man, completely inappropriate questioning strategies that we used with him. And in this case, obviously the one that we're talking about today. So really, I guess what I'm getting to is, does the recording actually offer any protection to suspects, particularly vulnerable suspects?
Absolutely, unequivocally, 110%. I firmly believe that if this had not been video recorded, that Rusan would be probably serving a life sentence for a crime that, by all measures, he did not commit.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it didn't, in this instance, prevent the officer performing a really bad interrogation. It didn't have that secondary line of prevention of the officer knowing that they were being recorded. Because this is an argument that's put forward in the UK often, that the bringing in of tape recording improves the quality of the police interviews and of the interviewers and led to more training and all sorts of benefits that are sort of secondary. In this case, the interview itself was bad, but at least because it was recorded, then the defense could go to someone like you and work through this interview to provide this detailed mapping of what had occurred. And that evidence was then available to the courts, and so much so that the judge found it obvious that the detail indeed came from the interviewer rather than from the suspect. So it's just there's different levels of protection maybe that videoing or tape recording can bring.
Because that wouldn't have been obvious, would it? It wouldn't have been obvious that all the information came from the police officer if we didn't have it in black and white in front of us.
It would have been, frankly, a nightmare for the defense if all they had was Detective Bowles's version, summary of his interaction with Rusan. The level of verbaling that I'm sure the detective would have produced, and by verbaling I mean just a summary in the detective's own words of what happened. I can only imagine how problematic that would have proved.
Have there been any other sort of similar cases that you've been involved in where you've kind of provided reports or testimony?
Where I've provided reports, yes. I mentioned that I provided testimony in California in a different murder case. That was technical. That had to do with syntax and missing. It was a second language speaker. English is a second language speaker. That had to do with gaps in his grammar. But as far as reports, yes, although I will say, hands down, this is the worst interviewer behavior I have seen in my confession cases. I've seen some actually that have come through where the interviewers do an excellent job and where the recording of the interaction and the interviewer's behavior actually becomes very problematic for the suspect because they are doing such a good job. The recording protects the police just as much as the suspect.
Of course, with recording not being particularly widespread, as we were talking about earlier, it does make you wonder kind of how much of this is actually going on that's not picked up on. Okay, I think we're going to bring it to an end there, Marlon. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Righting Wrongs.
So thank you, Marlon. That was a great discussion of the case. It's great to have a case from the US on righting wrongs. Of course, Dante Parker's murder remains unsolved, meaning that his killer has not been brought to justice. If you do have information, there's a link in the show notes to the police force. But if you have a question for us, remember you can always get in touch with the show via email. Righting Wrongs, that's WRITING WRONGS @aston.ac.uk.
If you've been affected by any of the themes in this week's episode, please consider contacting the resources in the episode description.
This has been Righting Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.